On April 9, 1942, approximately 75,000 soldiers laid down their weapons on a jungle road in the Philippines and surrendered to the Imperial Japanese Army. And among those 75,000 were 12,000 American soldiers who had fought for 99 days without reinforcement or resupply or hope of rescue. The American soldiers expected what the Geneva Convention promised: food, water, medical care, and proper treatment as prisoners of war. Instead, what followed was a 65-mile journey through equatorial heat and disease and systematic brutality that would kill thousands before they reached camp, and those who survived would face years of starvation and torture that would reduce 12,000 Americans to just 1,500 survivors by war's end. But how did nearly 90% of American prisoners captured at Bataan die in Japanese captivity? And what made the Bataan Death March one of the deadliest episodes in American military history? The fall of Bataan did not happen suddenly or unexpectedly, but rather it was the inevitable conclusion of a campaign that had been lost before it even began. Because when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and simultaneously launched an invasion of the Philippines, the American military in the Pacific was totally unprepared to defend the islands against a Japanese invasion force that had air superiority and naval superiority and overwhelming numbers of trained soldiers. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the combined American and Filipino forces in the Philippines, received orders to withdraw his troops to the Bataan Peninsula, which was a mountainous, jungle-covered strip of land on the western side of Manila Bay that was chosen as a defensive position where American forces could hold out until reinforcements arrived from the United States and American ships and soldiers could be sent to the Philippines to relieve the besieged garrison. But the reinforcements that MacArthur was promised never materialized because the United States Navy was still recovering from the losses at Pearl Harbor, and American military resources were being committed to defending other theaters of the Pacific War. And the soldiers defending Bataan slowly realized, as weeks turned into months, that no reinforcements were coming and that they had been abandoned to fight a hopeless battle against an enemy they could not defeat. For 99 days, the defenders of Bataan fought against a Japanese force that outnumbered them and controlled every supply line to the peninsula, and the American and Filipino soldiers fought in the sweltering heat of the Philippine jungle with decreasing supplies and decreasing hope, because malaria swept through the ranks of the defending army, and dysentery followed malaria, and the soldiers began to weaken from disease and from hunger as their food rations were cut again and again until they were surviving on quarter rations and eating monkeys and snakes and jungle leaves in desperate attempts to find any source of nutrition that might keep them alive. By March 1942, the soldiers who had weighed 180 pounds when they arrived in the Philippines weighed 120 pounds or less, and many of them were barely able to stand, let alone continue fighting against a Japanese army that was well-fed and well-supplied and growing stronger every day. On March 11, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued an order for General MacArthur to evacuate from the Philippines and travel to Australia, and MacArthur left the besieged garrison by PT boat and issued his famous declaration that he would return. But the soldiers he left behind received no such assurance and instead were left to continue fighting with no hope of relief and no hope of rescue. Major General Edward P. King, Jr., commanding the American and Filipino forces that remained on Bataan after MacArthur's departure, faced an impossible situation because his soldiers were dying from disease and starvation faster than the Japanese were killing them with bullets and artillery, and King believed that if he surrendered his army, the dying would stop and his soldiers would receive the medical care and food and water that the Geneva Convention promised to all prisoners of war. On April 9, 1942, General King made the decision to surrender his army to the Japanese, and he did so against the express orders of his superior officers who had told him to continue fighting even if it meant the death of every soldier under his command. But King believed that surrender offered the only chance to save the lives of his men, and that continuing to fight would result in meaningless deaths of soldiers who were already broken by disease and starvation and 3 months of continuous combat. The Japanese commander who received the surrender was shocked by the number of prisoners that King delivered to him, because the Japanese had expected to capture approximately 25,000 soldiers, but instead they received more than 75,000 prisoners, and the Japanese had made no plans for this number of prisoners because they had not expected that the American and Filipino forces would be able to field such large numbers of soldiers after such a long and exhausting campaign. The Japanese had no food for 75,000 prisoners, and no transport for 75,000 prisoners, and no facilities prepared to house 75,000 prisoners. But what they did have was a road, a 65-mile stretch of tropical road that ran north from the town of Mariveles at the southern tip of Bataan to the town of San Fernando, where the Japanese had a railroad that could transport the prisoners north to a prison camp at Camp O'Donnell. On April 9, 1942, the same day that General King surrendered his army, the Japanese ordered the prisoners to begin marching north along this road towards San Fernando, and the prisoners began their journey in groups that converged from multiple starting points on the southern end of the peninsula and joined the main road heading north, with some groups marching the full 65 miles from Mariveles to San Fernando, and others joining the road at various points along the route. The American soldiers who began this march were already broken men because they had been fighting for 3 months on starvation rations, and most of them were suffering from malaria or dysentery or both, and many of them had untreated wounds and infected cuts that had become gangrenous in the tropical heat and humidity. The prisoners were organized into groups of several hundred men and were marched at a pace that was impossible for weakened soldiers to maintain, and the Japanese guards who flanked these groups enforced this brutal pace through the use of bayonets and rifle butts and summary executions of soldiers who could not keep up or who fell to the ground from exhaustion and heat stroke. The temperature on the road exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit almost every day, and the humidity was suffocating and oppressive, and the prisoners received almost no water even though they marched past artesian wells and streams that could have provided them with life-saving water, because any soldier who broke ranks to drink from these water sources was immediately bayoneted or shot by the Japanese guards, who viewed such attempts to alleviate thirst as acts of disobedience that deserved immediate punishment. Men collapsed from heat stroke and dehydration as they marched along the road, and soldiers who fell to the ground and could not get up were either left on the road to die or were killed where they lay by the Japanese guards, who had no patience for stragglers and no interest in helping soldiers who could not maintain the pace of the march. The Japanese military regarded surrender as a disgrace and an act of cowardice, and under the code of Bushido that governed Japanese military culture, a soldier who surrendered had forfeited his honor and his right to humane treatment by his captors, and this meant that the Japanese viewed the American and Filipino prisoners not as soldiers who had fought bravely and deserved respect, but rather as men who had chosen dishonor and disgrace over death, and therefore deserved whatever brutality and punishment the Japanese could inflict upon them. The march lasted between 5 and 10 days, depending on where a prisoner entered the road and whether the Japanese allowed his group to rest for brief periods during the journey. But regardless of the exact length of time that individual groups marched, all of them converged at the town of San Fernando, where the Japanese packed the surviving prisoners into steel boxcars that had been designed for narrow-gauge rail and that were normally used to transport freight rather than human beings. The Japanese crammed approximately 40 men into each boxcar that had been built to safely accommodate only 8 men, and they sealed the doors of the boxcars and left no ventilation holes for fresh air to enter the cars. And as the train began to move north toward Capas, the prisoners inside the sealed boxcars began to suffocate in the stifling heat and the accumulated body heat and the overwhelming stench of human waste and vomit and death. Men who had somehow survived the march collapsed from suffocation, standing up in the darkness of the boxcars, and soldiers who had not yet died pressed their faces against the sealed doors in desperate attempts to find some source of air to breathe. And by the time the train arrived at Capas, hundreds of prisoners were dead or dying from suffocation and heat exhaustion inside the sealed boxcars. At Capas, the surviving prisoners were marched the final 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell, which had been a Philippine Army training facility before the Japanese converted it into a holding facility for the captured soldiers from Bataan and Corregidor. Camp O'Donnell was not designed to be a prison camp, and it was barely designed to accommodate 7,000 soldiers. But the Japanese had now crammed more than 70,000 prisoners into the camp, and the facility was completely unprepared for this overwhelming number of men who arrived in waves of several hundred after each day's transport from San Fernando. The camp commandant was Captain Yoshio Tsuneyoshi, and when the first groups of prisoners arrived at the camp, Tsuneyoshi delivered a speech to the assembled soldiers that survivors would remember for the rest of their lives, because Tsuneyoshi told them that they were not prisoners of war, but rather enemies of Japan and would be treated as enemies, and he told them that they had disgraced themselves by surrendering instead of fighting to the death, and he promised them that Japan would show them no mercy for their cowardice and their disgrace. The conditions at Camp O'Donnell were catastrophic, with only a single water spigot fed by a pipe from a nearby stream, and the line of prisoners waiting to reach this spigot stretched for hundreds of yards, and men waited for 6 hours or 8 hours in the tropical heat for a single canteen of water, and some died waiting in line. The latrines were open trenches that overflowed within days, and flies swarmed every surface, spreading dysentery with terrifying speed through the prisoner population. The Japanese had Red Cross supplies stockpiled in Manila but refused to distribute them, leaving prisoners to die of disease and starvation without any medical care. At the peak of the dying, the camp was losing approximately 50 American soldiers every single day, and as many as 400 Filipinos died on the worst days. Bodies were carried to mass graves in blankets, and burial details worked throughout the night, digging graves for their comrades. Between April 1942 and October 1942, approximately 1,500 American soldiers and more than 20,000 Filipino soldiers died at Camp O'Donnell from disease and starvation and neglect. The surviving American prisoners, approximately 6,000 men who survived the march and Camp O'Donnell, were transferred to Cabanatuan in Nueva Ecija province. The camp was larger and somewhat better organized, and it held more than 8,000 American prisoners at its peak, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers that made escape virtually impossible. The daily routine was defined by hunger, with prisoners receiving approximately 300 grams of rice per day, often contaminated with weevils and rat droppings. Men supplemented their rations by eating rats and snakes and whatever they could find, and diseases of starvation became endemic as their bodies consumed themselves from lack of nutrition. The deadliest month was July 1942, when 799 American prisoners died, and by war's end, more than 2,700 American prisoners had been buried in the camp cemetery. Beginning in 1942 and intensifying through 1944, the Japanese transferred prisoners from the Philippines to Japan and Manchuria and Korea and Formosa for forced labor in coal mines and steel mills and shipyards and factories. The ships that carried these prisoners, known as hell ships, were unmarked merchant vessels and rusted freighters that bore no Red Cross insignia required by international law. Under international law, ships carrying prisoners of war were required to display Red Cross markings, but the Japanese ignored this requirement entirely and attempted to hide the presence of prisoners on these ships. Allied submarines and aircraft patrolling the waters of the South China Sea attacked these unmarked ships without knowing prisoners were aboard. Across the entire war, approximately 126,000 Allied prisoners were transported on 134 Japanese hell ships over 156 separate voyages, and an estimated 21,000 Allied prisoners died on these ships or as a direct result of the conditions aboard them, which meant that 40% of all American POW deaths in the Pacific occurred on the hell ships. The most notorious was the Oryoku Maru, which departed Manila on December 13, 1944, carrying more than 1,600 American prisoners in its cargo holds. The ship was attacked by American aircraft the following day and was forced to beach in Subic Bay, and hundreds of prisoners died in the bombing and in the sealed holds of the ship. The survivors were transferred to two other ships, the Onora Maru and the Brazil Maru, which continued the voyage to Japan. And by the time the Brazil Maru reached its destination in late January 1945, only approximately 300 of the original 1,600 prisoners were still alive. The prisoners who survived the hell ships arrived in Japan and were assigned to work in coal mines on Kyushu and in steel mills in Osaka. In the coal mines, prisoners were lowered into narrow shafts hundreds of feet below the surface and forced to extract coal with hand tools for 12 to 16 hours every day, and the tunnels were unstable and ventilation was minimal, so men worked in near total darkness, breathing coal dust that destroyed their lungs. The daily ration was a bowl of rice and a cup of thin soup, and some prisoners weighed less than 90 pounds by the time the war ended. By late 1944, the war had turned decisively against Japan. General MacArthur returned to the Philippines in October 1944, and as American forces advanced across Luzon in January 1945, a new and urgent danger emerged for the remaining prisoners because the Japanese had implemented a policy to execute all prisoners of war rather than allow them to be liberated by American forces. In December 1944, at a camp on Palawan, Japanese guards herded 150 American prisoners into air raid shelters, doused them with gasoline, and set them on fire, and only 11 men escaped from this massacre. On January 30, 1945, a force of 121 United States Army Rangers from the 6th Ranger Battalion, supported by Alamo Scouts and approximately 200 Filipino guerrillas, launched a raid on the Cabanatuan prison camp. They marched 30 miles behind Japanese lines to reach the camp, and the raid lasted 30 minutes. The Rangers attacked at dusk, overwhelming the Japanese guards and liberating more than 500 prisoners. Many of the freed men were so weak they could not walk, and Rangers carried them on their backs. General MacArthur called it the most satisfying moment of the entire campaign. After the war ended on September 2nd, 1945, thousands of American prisoners were liberated from camps across Japan and Manchuria and Korea and Formosa, and many of them weighed less than 100 pounds, and many could not stand without assistance. Of the approximately 12,000 American soldiers captured at Bataan, roughly 10,500 died in Japanese captivity, representing a death rate of 87.5% and demonstrating the systematic brutality of the Japanese prison camp system. After the war, General Masaharu Homma, who had commanded the Japanese 14th Army that conquered the Philippines, was arrested and tried for war crimes. The trial established the legal principle of command responsibility, meaning that a military commander is accountable for war crimes committed by troops under his command, even if he did not directly order those crimes. Homma was found guilty and was executed by firing squad on April 3, 1946, and his trial set a precedent that would influence international law for decades to come. The survivors of the Bataan Death March returned to the United States in the final months of 1945, and they were met by families who barely recognized them because of their emaciated appearance and hollow eyes. What they carried with them had no name in 1945 and would not be called post-traumatic stress disorder until 1980. Many survivors never spoke about what happened to them, and their families learned not to ask questions, and the road from Mariveles became a private geography that they visited every night in their dreams but never mentioned during the day. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.